Good morning, everyone. It is Thursday, May 14th. Welcome to the second part of yesterday's lecture on global warming. Today, we're going to define and examine evidence for global warming. We're going to describe the effects of global warming in our notes today, and I need you to also submit a picture of your notes for homework. So this is third day in a row we're doing that. Next week, we are going to change things up. Because it's getting nicer out finally, we're going to be having you guys learn about Pennsylvania birds, and some of your assignments may involve going out and finding them, recording them, taking pictures of them. Okay, so global warming, the debate. The facts I want to provide you with, I tried to cite all of them. You can see the links below, but it's important to me that you don't just take my word for this. All the facts I have on this page are from NOAA. Okay, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. They are our government association that looks at things like this. That's their primary function, is looking at oceanic and atmospheric data. From their page, human activities have increased the natural concentration of CO2 in our atmosphere, amplifying Earth's natural greenhouse effect. So that's accepted. That is accepted as truth, okay, by our own government association. They also wrote the global average of CO2 hit a new record high in 2018, over 400 parts per million. Here's a diagram of that. The pink line is the atmospheric composition of CO2. The blue line is our CO2 emissions. And as you can see, they go hand in hand, increase, okay? So as one increases, the other increases. And as you heard Dr. Richard Alley say, it's us, okay? We are the reason that the CO2 is rising at this rate. Now, if global energy demand continues to grow and be met mostly with fossil fuels, the atmospheric CO2 is projected to exceed 900 parts per million by the end of this century. So this line already looks extremely steep. Picture it twice as high, more than twice as high, up here. And if we continue at the current rate, that's what we're headed for. Here is another graph from NOAA, and they're just showing the atmospheric concentrations of all the greenhouse gases that we talked about. In a relatively short period of time, we have had a 41% increase in greenhouse gases. That's just since 1990, okay? That's not that long ago. I mean, you guys weren't born yet, but I certainly was. Another graph, we're looking at the atmospheric CO2 level, and this just goes back thousands of years, okay? So our current level, we can see, is not within this normal, typical fluctuation. This is when Neanderthals lived. This is us, okay? This goes back even farther. It goes back to before Neanderthals. We have Homo erectus here. And again, we're looking back and we're just trying to see, is this an anomaly or is this part of the natural fluctuation? It seems to be quite an anomaly. Now, we talked about how in the heck do we know this? How can scientists, have this actual data? Remember, it's in ice cores. So this is very acceptable, reliable data. The bubbles of gas in these ice cores that we drill down in, we can, depending on how many layers we see, we can then kind of figure out how old each ice layer is. So it's really a fascinating process. But unfortunately, it confirms what we have been worried about. The last time CO2 levels were at today's level of about 400 parts per million was the Pliocene epoch, okay? And at this time, humans didn't exist. Global temperature was about 5 to 7 degrees warmer. And what that meant was sea level at that time was 131 feet higher. Imagine the effect that would have on the Earth currently, okay? There is strong evidence that the Earth is heating up. We just looked at evidence that CO2 and greenhouse gases are on the rise. Let's look at some evidence that the Earth is heating up, presumably caused by the rise in CO2 and other gases. Now, this is again from NOAA, and this is showing temperature anomalies. So this is kind of our baseline, and baseline is about 57 degrees. That was taken as an average from like 1950 to 1980, and they kind of use that as their baseline. Anytime we have a year that kind of dipped below, they're showing it in blue. Anytime we have years that spiked above that, they're in red. And as we can see, the current trend from about 1980 on is we are continually getting higher and higher away from our baseline. Now, don't just take our government agency's word for it. This graph is showing global temperature changed over time by many different agencies, 5 different agencies, as you can see down here. Some of them from our country, some from other countries, some kind of from international associations. And they all follow almost exactly the same trend. So this is not just us, this is globally. There is consensus. Now, sometimes when, I hear people talking about global warming, since 1880, we've had about a 2 degree Fahrenheit rise in global temperature. A lot of people say, well, that's just 2 degrees, big deal. But remember, this is a 2 degree global change. To think about how much energy it would take to heat up all of the oceans, all the land, all the atmosphere, and the entire Earth by 2 degrees. You know how much extra heat that would take? A lot. So that is why a 2 degree global change is extremely significant. At 7 degrees less than it is today, we were in an ice age. So 7 degrees doesn't seem like that much either. But we were here, you were here, if we actually existed at the time, buried under miles of ice. So a few degrees makes a huge difference. Over the next 100 years, the temperature could rise by 7 degrees. So we saw what a 7 degree decrease, the great amount that changed the Earth. 7 degrees hotter could be, I don't know what you call the opposite of an ice age, but that is presumably what we're headed for. The decline of most species? I don't know. Maybe us? I don't know. Now, the evidence of warming is most visible in the ice. That's why you hear, like Dr. Ali is a glaciologist, oftentimes these are the experts we're turning to. The Patagonia glaciers, this picture is old, that's why it's black and white. Here's what it looks like today. So all this ice, gone. The Muir Glacier in Alaska in 1941 and now in 2004. 1941 again. Here's another glacier, and also in Alaska. And again, this is not, geologically, this is not a long time. This is like the blink of an eye. That's what I think some people don't realize. Great ecological change you can see here. And lastly, in the McCarthy Glacier. So this isn't just one isolated incident. This is happening, glaciers all over the world. Now, one interesting thing that I want to use as an example of what we call a positive feedback loop in science is the fact that snow and ice caps are melting also exacerbates the temperature increase. And here's why. See this nice, white, shiny, bright ice and snow? It reflects a lot of solar radiation. So it actually has a cooling effect because it has a high albedo. Albedo talks about how reflective a surface is in terms of bouncing radiation back into space. Now, as it melts, okay, and as this white surface gets smaller and smaller, less light, less radiation is going to be reflected back into space. So this is going to then heat up the oceans, and it's going to exacerbate and increase that warming process. And this is what we call in science a positive feedback loop. Positive feedback loops are not good things, okay? I know it sounds weird because it's like positive is good. No, never, not in science or engineering. Positive feedback loops mean something is going to spiral out of control. Less snow and ice means warmer temperatures because there's more radiation being absorbed rather than reflected, which means warmer temperatures means more sunlight's absorbed by the seas, which is then going to cause less snow and ice, which is going to cause warmer temperatures, and around we go until things spiral out of control. Negative feedback loops are actually the ones that are stable. They're kind of self-regulating. So positive feedback loops are very dangerous situations. Another example of a positive feedback loop is the permafrost melting. And we talked a little bit about this yesterday, but the permafrost, did you guys know, is that solid frozen land that's permanently frozen in the tundra, and it's most common at higher latitudes. So we don't have permafrost here in Pennsylvania, but there's a ton of it in northern lands. Okay, the purple areas have year-round permafrost. This is a large, large amount of land we're talking. Now, as the planet warms, the permafrost is melting. There is dead plant and animal matter, which we know contains carbon. And as that plant and animal matter becomes available as the ground thaws, the decomposers are going to use it as a food source. As they eat it, they're going to digest it and they're going to release methane. So think of there being a ton of potential methane that is now thawing out and possibly, as it is eaten by decomposers, transformed into methane gas. Yesterday we mentioned, but I just want to reiterate, methane is 25 times more potent than CO2. So it's an extremely effective greenhouse molecule, and that's one of the reasons why we want to keep tabs on it. Hopefully you saw one of the videos. Here's another one of methane burping lakes because the bottom of the lake's thawing. So this is just showing you how much methane can get trapped under there and is eventually released. This is also a positive feedback loop. Again, the thawed soil can release the methane. Temperature rises. As temperature rises, more permafrost thaws, and it goes on and on and on at a faster and faster rate. Okay, so let's talk about the impacts of global warming. These are just the major ones that came to mind. There's a lot of smaller ones, but we're just going to kind of hit the high ones, and unfortunately there's a lot of them. Number one, the spread of disease. As the planet warms, disease-carrying insects are going to be able to migrate north. They're going to have a wider range of areas they can survive in. They're going to bring their disease with them, okay? Things like malaria, which thankfully we don't have to deal with very much here. Zika. One thing we do have to deal with here, Lyme disease. And I think you would agree that Lyme disease is definitely spiking. I told you my son had Lyme disease pretty significantly. His knee actually swelled up to where he couldn't walk and he had to get it drained. So this is one that's very concerning to me. I found another tick on him, unfortunately, the other day, but thankfully we did kind of the preventative dose of medicine. Anyway, so this is happening, in my opinion, right now. Number two, more frequent and intense large storms. So this was just in 2004, we had all these different storms, not necessarily at the same time, but they all occurred. I can't remember having as many tropical storms in a given year as we've had in the last 10 years. Katrina was in 2004 and 2005. Longer droughts and more intense heat waves. This is going to result in desertification of lands, which we talked about as being extremely detrimental to our food supply. This is because it challenges the agricultural industry. Okay? Loss of agriculture leads to food deprivation, and we believe it's going to hit Africa the hardest. Now, keep in mind, this is being compounded by the fact that our population is increasing exponentially. So we might need to double our food generation by 2050 to feed the growing population. That's going to be really hard if we're decreasing our amount of usable land due to desertification.